perspective of, oh, there's my mic, taking a perspective of somebody in the church and just applying that and sharing thoughts and ideas about those kind of things. So that's what's going to be going on here in a couple of minutes, and I hope y'all do enjoy. Yeah, there we go, lights. We got lights. I don't know. Your thing's not on. Hold the red button. Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of Right Before. I just want to say hello to all the guests we have here at Philadelphia Church and all those who may or may not be viewing online right now. Today we have another session back at it again with our very own Pastor Mike. Good to see you, sir. Good to have you again after these 3 weeks have passed. How you doing?
I am doing great. Thanks for having me, brother.
Of course, it's always my pleasure. And I got to say again, it's great to see all these beautiful, wonderful faces back in the church. You know, it's been a long time since we've been able to congregate and just express, feelings of grace and appreciation in God's house. So it's good to see all of y'all once again. Without further ado, let's get right on into it. Today here on Right Before, we're going to talk about the whole situation with Miss Sha'Carri Richardson, one of the U.S. very own, very talented, athletic, and profound young lady doing amazing things, being shut out from being able to compete in the Olympics. And, that's starting, I think, this week, no? This coming week? Yesterday? Okay, and that's great to see. What are your thoughts on this entire situation?
So her situation, man, there's so many different layers to it, right? She was banned, not banned, but she was barred from competing in the competition because of inducing marijuana right before the trials, and she tested positive for marijuana use. And so it created this larger discussion of marijuana use, and then it really was a discussion about depression because she had just recently found out that she lost her biological mother, had passed away. And so while some were having a conversation about just you shouldn't do marijuana and you shouldn't do marijuana, others were having conversations about mental health issues and how do we deal and cope with depression. And she was honest and forthcoming about that she made a mistake while, the culture, for so to speak, was like, no, let her raise. You know how that was. Sha'Carri really took ownership and said, no, listen, I knew this was wrong. I did it. I made a mistake. But a lot of times it's incumbent upon us to speak larger to an issue, not just leave it as in isolation, but talk about the larger issue, not only of marijuana use, but I know we're going to get into the incarceration rates and how, particularly for black men, a lot of us are in prison because of nonviolent drug offenses like marijuana, but then also this mental health issue, and how do we deal with coping with loss and depression and things of that nature. So I think it created so many lanes for so many conversations.
I completely agree, and I think it's also important to know, like you were saying, a bigger part of that is mental health, when so much and so oftentimes we focus on demonizing the character of the person instead of trying to uplift the content that needs that uplifting. Like in the areas they struggle, why don't we look to help instead of criticize and break down? We got to build up. And looking at that, another thing I wanted to ask you is, when it comes to these athletes, a lot of times, do you feel like their mental health, I know it's something that's more, we're getting more focus on it now and today here in 2021, but a lot of times, do you feel like their mental health and their overall health and their being as a person is overlooked?
Sure, absolutely. I think that's one of the huge problems with how, because we have a culture that deifies athletes. Like we put them on a pedestal for their athletic abilities, forgetting as you said, the human side of things, that they're actual humans. They cry, they laugh, they have emotions, but we only see them through the lens of their particular skills. And I think it pushes this feeling of, I have to live up to the standard. I was watching yesterday a swimmer. I'm forgetting her name, but she was going to compete in the Paralympics, and she's deaf and blind, and she was unable to come and compete because they wouldn't allow her to have that many assistants at the Olympics. But there was a thing when she was having a conversation, she was talking on CNN, and what she said was, I'm known as this person who swims. And I was able to, my disability was able to fall in the background. I was just known as her name, Swimmer. While I understood her point about the fact that she didn't want to be known for just her disability, that comment is typically a lot of comments athletes make, but to the negative, which is, I'm only known as the athlete. We know Laura Ingraham told LeBron James, shut up and dribble. So too often athletes are just only viewed from their athletic prowess, as opposed to, for example, Sha'Carri Richardson, who we're talking about, she just lost her mother. So what do we do as a community? I'm sure her family was rallying around her and supporting her, but what do we do as a community when we know that people are suffering loss? It doesn't matter what their athletic prowess is. What do we do about that? And I think that is the deeper question of, can we restore the humanity of athletes? Can we separate the fact that they play a sport, or however they're successful? Can we look at the humanness of them and start to address those issues and really support them?
Yeah, of course. And that's an excellent point to note and an excellent view to take, not only seeing them just as who they are or what they are in terms of their sport, their competition, or their skill set, but who they are as people and what entirely, encompasses all of what they do. Because like you were saying, at the end of the day, there's a lot more to a person than just what I do at work. Right. For example, like I got my job at Whataburger. I'm not just somebody that goes back there and flips burgers. And I think a lot of times when we have people quit our job, it's because at the end of the day, you forget to remember that your employee is not just an employee. No matter how professional you have to be, whatever setting it is, whether you're working at a fast food restaurant or you're working at a business higher up, you got to remember that the people that work with you or work there with you are going to have emotions and feelings at the end of the day.
That's right.
And as we look at that, another part I want to cover, this whole situation with the whole cannabis use and all that, what are your feelings in terms, and what are your thoughts in terms of the discipline when it comes to cannabis as a whole, and how it affects not just people, but a lot of times often people of color in our community?
Sure. So, great question. And you have two things operating there. You have the sort of the moral or societal aspect of cannabis use. And then you have, like, when you said our community, the black community, then you're talking about the legalities behind it. And we know that there are many states that are making cannabis use legal in America. So you now have a big drum swell, and as we talked earlier, you have a situation where there are so many black and brown people in prison for nonviolent drug offenses, meaning mostly cannabis. So you now have that question. People are saying, well, if you're now going to make it legal, then shouldn't those people come out of prison for that? And so that's the legal standpoint. But then you have the moral standpoint. Of course, we're Christians, we're believers in God, so now that's a deeper moral, spiritual, philosophical question of should you use, should you not use, what's the nuance, what does it do to your body? Now, we have medical health professionals in our church, so they can speak more to the medicinal aspect of it because there is some studies have shown it, but its effect on your being or who you are, does it change your mindset? Does it make you move in a different way? How does it affect you? I've had experience with cannabis use, and it does have an effect on your body and on your mind and your ability to function. And God asks us to surrender our minds, not to mean you're a mindless drone walking around, but that God can hear, that you can adequately hear God when he's speaking to you. But when you're under the influence, can you? That's one of those questions that we ask from a larger perspective. And again, this is what came as a result of the Sha'Carri Richardson situation, was this conversation of, hey, marijuana use, it's here, it plagues our community. Now, a lot of communities use marijuana use, but particularly the lens was on our community. The microscope was on our community because Sha'Carri Richardson is black. And so it does go into some of these deeper conversations, and I think, I'll just say this, I think there's a lot of nuance that we tend to ignore, and we don't want to have these conversations. We just demonize whoever was smoking weed. We demonize them and say they're the worst, and or on the other spectrum, we say, oh, it's perfectly fine, well, let's all laugh. And the truth is somewhere in the middle, and we have to be honest to have those conversations.
Okay, so it's more of like, I don't want to say it's not a black or white thing because it's not a simple answer at the end of the day. Sure. That's what we're trying to get to. That's the point. That's right. But we want to understand is that there's negatives and the positives, and we want to take it in the full spread. We want to look at it in full spectrum. We want to look at it as in a whole. That's right. And as we look at these pieces and we look at this person and the situation that we deal with, and we take, for example, like not just Sha'Carri Richardson, but there's been many other athletes before her to come and support, like Patrick Mahomes would say. For those who don't know, Patrick Mahomes is a quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs, MVP. He's an outstanding quarterback. But besides that, you see athletes who have a grand scale of their own, such as like LeBron James looking to support and back them up. Mm-hmm. And I would think, and we would all think, if it was such a demonizing offense or something that was so horrible, then why would we have so many people come to stand behind her, especially those, not just in our community, but those who have so much to lose at such a high point, take a stance behind someone like that. And looking at that, I also want to ask, like, what is it you think we're missing or may be there or may not be there, need to be fixed or changed at that level in terms of the Olympics when it comes to taking care of their athletes?
Well, it goes back to your larger point of, are we seeing them beyond just, oh, you play a sport? Are we viewing them as human beings? Because that's our baseline. If we start at that baseline, you're a human and I'm a human. We're both made in the image of God. God loves us equally. If we start there, then we can start to say, okay, well, how does this actually affect a human being? What does it do? What scale does it affect? How do we navigate through these situations? But the fundamental question, or the fundamental principle is that this is an image bearer of God. So I have to give love. And Jesus tells us the greatest commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Love is such a profound thing that we throw the word around, but it really has a very powerful impact. So the Olympics, and some are going to say, oh, well, of course a pastor's talking about love. Yeah, well, yeah, so are humans. Like we're all in some ways looking for love and experiencing love in different levels. So if we could start there, and the I think it's the IOC for the Olympics, if they could start there with recognizing these are not just pawns on a chessboard. These are actual humans with real emotions. And again, with Sha'Carri, she's coping with something. It's not about if you're justifying it or not, but it's recognizing at that fundamental level. And your question is, how do we create a structure that she doesn't have to go that route for coping? What do you do to put things in place? Where are the counselors? Where are the different tools and mechanisms? Where are the spiritual leaders? I'm willing to throw that in there. That there needs to be a spiritual aspect to it, because that's what's the issue. But that's what you're asking, is how do we put things in place so that they don't have to go to these different routes? Because it couldn't just, that's not the only substance abuse that it could be. There's other things that people use to cope, whether it be heroin, whether it be abusing alcohol. There's so many things that people can use to cope. So I think the IOC and all these other professional sports and entities, I know the NBA does a lot of therapy, has different staffers that will be there for mental health issues. So we have to stop always, and it's just really as it relates to society too. Too often we deal with symptoms of problems, not the actual problems. So what you're asking is a phenomenal question, is how do we deal with the root cause?
Exactly, and I think that's an extremely good point that you made in terms of looking at the larger component that needs to be addressed, distributed, and assessed in that situation, and that is love. Love is one of the biggest things we oftentimes, I think, miss and fail to include in our treatment of other people in terms of how we look, see, view, or judge them in a particular point in time. And as we look at this and see, one thing I wanted to focus on, as you covered and I thought was great, is that the whole idea that the biggest things that are often missing are that spiritual component. Yeah. Like you were saying, there's a lack of that. It's not seen, and you don't have a lot of times in situations, you don't have someone to turn to. I would feel like, so I compare it to this, the NBA bubble. We saw that happen last year. You take all these players from 30 different teams, put them in a bubble, and let them sit there for our entertainment. And at the end of the day, I'm looking at that, and it's like, oh, yeah, you're God and made. You're in this very extremely nice resort, and you got all this food and all that kind of things. Right. But up until the finals, they weren't allowed to have their family there. They weren't allowed to have friends there. It was them isolated most of the time in a room, focused on that one thing. And that's a lot of sacrifice at the end of the day.
That's right.
So where do you turn to? Because I know by myself, when it came to being in quarantine, I'd spend a lot of time, way more time in my room than I was used to. I was often, like we talked about before on a previous, right before segment, you're met with feelings and entities you've never known before in terms of depression, anxiety, and all these things that oftentimes come and you have to battle. And as you see that, and as we focus on Sha'Carri, I can't imagine what she was dealing with losing a mother. Because I have both my grandparents, and I'm blessed to say I have my parents in my life. Losing something like that, I'm understanding that, like you're saying, when you deal with a person, love needs to be distributed.
That's right.
Not sometimes, and of course, discipline, of course, is an action, because she knew what was going to happen in terms of the weight of her actions. But like we were saying before, like I think you noticed too, when someone is faced with a certain situation, like you just brought up, where are her other routes? Where are her other alleyways? Where are the other ways she can go? Another question I want to ask, though, too, is when it comes to the spiritual, this component, how much of it do you think, or I won't say that, when it comes to spiritual, like now we just see on the Olympic board, but in terms of here in the United States as well, because like we see, like you were saying before, there's a lot of it seems there's like a lot of unfair treatment in terms, we already know this at the prison level, at the society level, for people of color in the community. What, in terms of spirituality and God, how much of that are we missing? How much of that do we need at those levels, whether it's at the community level, at the level of government, or at the level of prison reform and those things of that nature?
Man, the heavy questions. You've been doing this for a while, huh? It's heavy questions, brother. But great questions. And so from the spiritual standpoint, I mean, the easy answer is yes, we need more of a spiritual awakening, I should say. There was one in America, but you're starting to see them. Statistically, you see more people. It's a group called nuns. Those are people that typically don't identify either way on their spiritual belief, and that group is growing, as well as the atheist group. Atheist meaning non-belief in a theistic. Theism is a belief in God, so a non-belief in God. So you see that group growing. And with culture and how things are playing out, you are seeing a turning away from God, so to speak. And so you're beginning to see that play out in culture, because I believe that if you have the right spirituality, now let's be, and I say that not to exclude, but there are certain. Well, let me just give you an example. When we think about slavery in America, America was founded on slavery. A lot of those slave masters believed in the Bible that we read today, and they quoted from it. Particularly, they quoted from Leviticus 25. So that's what I mean by the right way, because what our Bible is powerful. It's the Word of God, but in addition to the Bible, we have an experience, meaning each of us were created in the image of God. So we have an understanding of what the right is. It's innate in us. And so that was clearly wrong. But again, if you just say spiritual or religious for that aspect, then you have people operating against God. So I think we have to have a right understanding of who God is and how he revealed himself through his word and through our lives. And if we get that, if we understand, again, Jesus gave the principles. He could have said, oh, well, thou shalt not kill, or he could have he could have recited Moses' Decalogue just to say, okay, here it is, give it itemized. But he summarized it to make it more powerful. Love God and love man. And that creates a huge responsibility for every individual to love man. And what does love feel like? Well, you understand love from a certain degree, so you know what feels like lovingness and what doesn't. So if someone gets caught making a mistake, Sha'Carri, they make a huge mistake, well, what would love do in that response? Would love demonize her? Would love say, oh, see, black people, we do it. They're always smoking weed. That's their problem. They're always going through this. Or would love say, this was because of if I understand your mom passed, I can't imagine what that feels like to lose your mother. Can you talk to me a little bit about what emotions you were feeling in that moment? Who did you talk to? See, this is the response that love has. Love says, I value you so much. I love you so much that we'll deal with the mistake in a certain way. But the first thing I'm going to do is tell you how much I love you, how much I support you. That is but see, that's the character of Jesus. So that is the spirituality that we have to enter into, because again, everybody can have their own opinions, but there needs to be some objective, that is to say, apart from us, some objective standard of good that we can appeal to that says, no, calling her a N-word or anything, no, that's not right. That's not what she deserves. Loving her, sitting next to her, talking to her about her struggles, asking her what was that like, because I believe she didn't really know her mother that well because she was raised by a grandmother. What were those situations like for all of us in dealing with the different issues in life? And so, yeah, I think that spiritual component is lacking, and once we restore it, we start to show the character of Christ. We could just say it, but we have to show it and display it in our everyday lives. I believe that can make a pivot. I know it can make a pivotal change in the way that we view not only ourselves, but the way we interact with one another.
And I think that is extremely, I don't know if y'all heard what he just said, but that was amazing. That was great.
Appreciate you.
To look at it from that viewpoint and have that kind of mentality when facing someone else that goes through a certain situation, which in terms to I'd be able to relate, because I'm raised by my grandparents, like I said before. I don't get to know my mother or my father as well as I would want to, but I know if I was faced with a certain situation like that or being in that type of moment, then I would want to receive love, and I wouldn't want to be criticized for not doing this or not doing that in that moment. That's what you need. And I think another point to look at, what I get from what you said, is that you got to have that characteristic of, like Jesus said, those among you who are without sin cast the first stone. Mm-hmm. And ain't none of us been there, have none of us been able to experience that, because the only man that ever walked this earth and not committed any sin was Jesus himself.
Amen.
So can't none of us ever go to another person and try and act like we are better than them.
That's right.
Because we are all the same. That's something I look and I know.
Absolutely.
But as we get to, I'd say 11:30 through 11:35 here, I just want to say once again, Pastor, I appreciate you coming on, being on here right before. It's always a pleasure. I want to thank everybody who's here at Philly today at the church. It's a blessing to see each and every single one of your faces, and it's a blessing to be able to go up before you and have these conversations.
Absolutely.
This has been right before. I hope each and every single one of you were able to take something from this and work it within your week. It's been blessed to be up here before you. I'm Damien, and see you next time, y'all.
Yeah, that was nice.